come up meeting. The talk will be recorded, just only the main part, and then we'll turn off the recording for the Q&A session, which is going to be the second half of today's meeting. And so, yeah, don't feel shy about asking questions then. Just a final reminder, please keep your mics muted during the talk. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lorijn, Dr. Lorijn Zaadnoordijk. Dr. Lorijn did her PhD at the Dundas Institute, where she worked together with Professor Sabine Hunjes on the emerging sense of agency in infancy. And during this time, she also visited Monash University in Australia to collaborate, or New Zealand, to collaborate with Tim Bain and Jacob Howie. And currently she's employed as a Marie Curie Fellow at Trinity College Dublin, working together with Roderick Cusack on the influence of parent-child interaction on early development. She's also currently co-leading a big international multi-lab consortium project that aims to make the method of online testing of infants and children robust and globally accessible, something that's especially important during the COVID pandemic at this time. And today, Lorijn will tell us about how sense of agency develops in infancy. So Lorijn, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for having me. Let me share my slides with you. Right. Okay, so hi everyone. Sabine has done a really good introduction. So I'm Lorijn. I'm currently working at Trinity College, and so my slides are also on the Trinity College background. But actually, all of the work that I'm presenting today was done at the Dundas Institute in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, in collaboration with the Baby and Child Research Center. And my supervisor was Sabine Hunjes, who has been involved in pretty much all of the work that I'm presenting today. So when I was preparing for my job application to the PhD, I read this article by Sarah Jane Blakemore and Chris Frith, which started with this quote, and it really struck me. It resonated very much with what I imagine it is like to be an infant, and sort of how you sort of have to, I don't know, make sense of all the sensory inputs that you're getting and understanding how they relate to each other and how you relate to them. And so for me, this quote really sort of highlights the discovery of the structure that our infants are trying to find in the world. And so the quote goes like this: she raised one hand and flexed its fingers and wondered, as she had sometimes before, how this thing, this machine for gripping, this fleshy spider on the end of her arm, came to be hers, entirely at her command. Or did it have some life of its own? When did it know to move? And when did she know to move it? So it's a quote from Ian McEwan from Atonement, and I just wanted to sort of give you this quote as a starting point into this presentation. So I will be talking to you about the sense of agency, and what do we mean by the sense of agency is then maybe the first question. So it is a slightly difficult question to answer, and I will get back to that later. But let's for now say roughly that the sense of agency is the feeling that one can cause things to happen. So a question for me then is this baby experiencing himself as causing the balloons to move? It's clear that he's having fun, right? But does he also have agentive awareness? So we know that from behavior alone, we cannot always conclude what is going on in the mind. But of course, since this is a baby, we also can't ask him. And so my PhD research has for a large part focused on the question, how can we even research this question? How can we even ever know what babies are experiencing? And before getting into that research, I want to slightly prematurely perhaps already give you one of the takeaway messages from this presentation. And I know the conventional moment to do that is at the end of the presentation, and I promise there will be more take-home messages at the end. But I think it's good to sort of set the scene a little bit. So this is my take-home message, one of my take-home messages for you. Infant scientists are not studying incompliant, smelly, miniature adults. Now, the reason I say this is not only because infants' cognition still needs to mature during development. This is, of course, also true, and I think it's important to take into account. And it's studied by, of course, many developmental scientists, as the name would suggest. but also because infant researchers like myself, who are interested in the emergence of a capacity, are not necessarily asking the question under which conditions is an already developed capacity active, or how can I manipulate it, or whatever, but rather, is the capacity present at all? And how can I differentiate between someone who has the capacity versus someone who does not? And what is necessary for the capacity to emerge. So this is sort of what I would like you to have as a sort of mindset when going into this presentation. So for my research, it means that I'm asking two questions. I am asking the questions about the challenge that the infants have to solve, namely, how do I come to experience my actions as having consequences? As well as the challenge for the scientists, how can we even study whether a sense of agency is present in a pre-verbal population? So what I want to do is to argue that we can get some insight in it. And I want to show you how I did this for a sense of agency. So we first came up with a framework. This is work together with Carlos Zetnik. And this framework has been influenced a lot by ideas from mechanistic explanation, Bill Bechtel and others, and functional analysis, which basically states that a mechanism is sufficient to produce a phenomenon if all its parts and components together can, or is explanatory for a phenomenon if all of the parts and components together can produce the phenomenon. So when I talk about a mechanism here, it's not necessarily a brain mechanism. It can also be a cognitive mechanism. In my work, it's more often cognitive than brain. But it just means that there's a set of parts and processes that in interaction give rise to a phenomenon. And basically, the steps will be familiar to you also. So you want to, of course, start with describing the capacity of interest. You want to find those mechanisms that are in principle capable of producing this phenomenon. Then you are trying to find evidence for at least one of these mechanisms in the population of interest. And if you have found evidence for a sufficient mechanism, then you can infer that the capacity of interest is present in that population. And basically what we said is we think we can also translate this idea to experiential states. Of course, we start just with step one. So in this work, I take a representational view on cognition and consciousness. This view states that an experience comes about by virtue of the underlying representation. That is, if I represent myself as causing an event, I will also experience myself as causing an event. Of course, assuming that I have the capacity to experience at all. I say that because, of course, there's also many AI researchers trying to implement sense of agency into robots, and I do not want to go as far as to say that those robots who have the representation necessarily experience anything. So important within the developmental context is that the contents of this representation do not necessarily have to be conceptual. So, for example, an individual can perceive a particular shade of a crimson object without possessing the concept crimson. And more generally, it's not implausible to assume that infants and potentially also non-human animals have the capacity to perceive a range of properties for which they lack the concepts. So in that sense, we're taking it that agentive experience is more akin to perception than it is to belief, and that the contents that characterize agentive experiences do, in that sense, not need to be conceptual. Another sort of important thing about the description of it is, so, right, like what type of content are we then looking for? And if you look into the agency literature, there are so many descriptions, and there are so many slightly different things. Of course, there's a lot of overlap with sense of body ownership and sense of control, even going into sense of responsibility. But even if you look into the sort of pure sense of agency literature, there are differences. So in philosophy, you will find often that people describe the sense of agency as the feeling that I cause my actions. In more experimental literature, you will find more often that it's the feeling that my actions cause an effect in the world. And then together with Tim Bain at Monash in Australia, indeed, Nadine, we also still differentiated between things like, occurrent agency, like I'm currently acting or I'm currently doing action X, versus background agency, I'm in principle able to act, I'm in principle able to do X. And so all of these things, of course, matter, right? Like they matter for the type of mechanisms that you need, and they matter for the type of representation that you're looking for. So in my work, I focus primarily on the sort of specific occurrence sense of agency in the form of my action A is currently causing effect E. And this is in line with a lot of the experimental work and is also arguably the type of agentive awareness that will emerge before a more generalized awareness. And as I'm taking a representationalist view on experiential states, in order to say that infants experience a sense of agency, I thus need to find evidence for a corresponding underlying representation and mechanism that can generate that representation. The agentive experience will then arise by virtue of those representations, assuming that infants have the capacity to experience, which I do. So, okay, we know what we're looking for now, and then we then went on to try to actually find mechanisms that can generate this representation. And we started this actually with sort of existing literature and existing mechanisms. And in the developmental literature, a lot of inspiration has been taken from adult literature and specifically from the comparator model from Blakemore, Frith, and Wolpert. And in the context of a sense of agency, what I have here is a very strongly simplified version of this model. So I take the simplified version of the model partly because it's going to be easier to explain, but also partly because this is more or less the version that has been adopted in developmental science. And I think that's a problem, and I will come back to that. But let me first explain what the model says. So what this model says is whenever you send out a motor signal, as it is conceived in development science, what this model says is whenever you send out a motor signal, two things happen. You make a prediction about the sensory consequence of that action or the sensory input that you will get after that action, and you will observe what happens. And if these two match, it is said you will experience a sense of agency. Now, this model in the original form is slightly more complex. It contains some feedback loops and some intention aspects and everything. Those things haven't really been adopted in developmental science, but the principle that this is what they extract from it makes sense, because what we see in adult literature is that indeed, whenever the action that the adult did and the sensory input that they got afterwards align, they report experiencing a sense of agency. So it makes sense, right, that developmental scientists have gone with that route. And researchers then have indeed tested whether infants can detect sensory motor contingencies, basically saying, okay, if they can detect this match, then they must have a sense of agency. Now, in work with Tarek Bezot and Sabine Honius, we have argued that this is too quick of a conclusion. So what we've been arguing is that actually passive contingency detection, namely this sort of match detection, is not sufficient. It may be necessary. It may be that you need this match to have a sense of agency, but you cannot, from just the match, say these inputs have a sense of agency. And the reason for that is that we're looking for a representation that says I caused, or my action E caused events. My action A caused event E. And a match in its nature could at best say predicted sensory input is equal to observed sensory input, but you can't say that there is a causal relation there. So what needs to happen is a causal inference. You need to have an inference after this match that, oh, since my prediction and my observation are in agreement with each other, that must mean I caused it. But this is not what the infant scientists are testing for. Now, to be clear, I do not think that this is necessarily a problem of the comparator model itself. So I don't want to sit here and argue that the comparator model is faulty. I don't know, but at least not based on what I'm saying. So it is a good model for the adult findings. And also, if I talk to motor control researchers, where the model originally comes from, they have no issue with the idea that there's a causal inference, and they do not see a contradiction with the comparator model. Where I think it goes wrong is that developmental scientists, as well as developmental roboticists, have taken the match as the defining feature. So I think it's basically a problem of a sort of a too simplistic translation from adult research, where if there is a match, adults report indeed a sense of agency. And this works in a population where the sense of agency is already present. So it might be that if you have a sense of agency, the match is the defining feature between whether or not you're experiencing a sense of agency at that point or not. But if you're trying to figure out whether a sense of agency is present, or in case of the robots, if you're trying to program it, there's suddenly a much stronger requirement for the sufficiency, not just the necessity. So while the match might be necessary for triggering the causal inference that then leads to a sense of agency, if you do not have that causal inference, there's also no reason to believe you will experience a sense of agency. And so what we've been arguing is that what you really need is evidence, not just for sensory motor contingency detection, which is a good first step, but also for that there's a sort of underlying causal model there that then can yield this causal representation of my action A caused event E. So what we then wanted to know is whether previously observed behavioral patterns in this context of sensory motor contingency detection could be taken as evidence for a sense of agency by investigating whether they provide evidence for a causal inference, right? Maybe the evidence that we have is just actually good enough. Maybe we can actually conclude it, and maybe we can say something about the causal model there. So we know from lots of infant research that by 2 months of age, infants produce an action more frequently when it's followed by an effect. So infants suck on a pacifier more when it's followed by a tone. They, they use a rattle more when the rattle is making noise. And one of the studies in which this has been tested is this mobile paradigm, in which infants are lying in a crib, mobile hanging above their bed. And there is, at least in a part of the experiment, a ribbon attached from one of the baby's limbs. In this case, it's the foot here in the bottom picture, to the mobile, such that when the baby moves, the mobile also moves. And what we're seeing is that babies start to increase their movement frequency whilst this mobile is connected. And depending a little bit on the age of the child, they will move all the limbs or only the limb that is connected, but it's a fairly robust finding. And some people have been taking this as evidence that infants indeed experience a sense of agency because, well, they're reacting to basically this sensory motor contingency. So what we did is we made a baby bot. We made an artificial baby agent in a simulated mobile paradigm. And just for the record, it was a very simplistic paradigm. It's not, I didn't create an entire world or anything, but we basically just wanted to have some simulation here. And we made this baby bot explicitly incapable of learning causal relations. Like, we wanted to make absolutely certain that this baby bot could not learn causal relations. And basically what we were arguing is, okay, so any behavior that we can replicate with the simulation that cannot learn causal relations cannot in itself be taken as evidence for causal model. Of course, it doesn't mean that the babies did not have a causal model. It just means that it's not differentiating evidence between having one or not having one. So basically we asked, is previously reported infant behavior truly evidence for an underlying causal model? And so I have some data here. So this is 3-month-old infant data from a study by Rovi Collier in the 70s. And what you're basically seeing here is that in the baseline phase, all the limbs were sort of moving at the same rate. And then as soon as they connected the mobile, the one that was connected went up, right? Like increased in movement frequency, the rest stayed fairly stable. And we wanted to just know, like, okay, if this is supposed to be the behavioral pattern that shows that infants have a sense of agency, then surely our baby bot should not be able to replicate that pattern. You, I guess, know where we're going with this. Of course, we were able to replicate this pattern with a system that has sort of no capacity for learning causal relations. So what we're trying to show here is not that these babies don't have a sense of agency, I don't know, but that this behavioral pattern in itself is not sufficient evidence that they have it. Now, what we also saw was that in the babies, after the mobile was connected, they initially increased in movement frequency. So they had what we call an extinction burst, and they just first really moved more and then sort of slowly, stopped moving again. And with our baby bot, we were not able to replicate that pattern. So no matter how much we would mess around with the parameters or something, this is something that just fundamentally we could not replicate with the learning mechanism that was implemented in the baby bot. So we thought maybe actually, instead of looking at this sort of connect phase where the movement frequency is increasing, we should be looking at the disconnect phase to see how babies are reacting to this sudden change in the sudden sort of cessation of the sensory motor contingencies.
Lorijn, can I just ask quickly about what do you mean by the learning algorithm not having a causal model?
So what we implemented is sort of operant conditioning in its simplest form. Mm-hmm. And basically this baby bot basically has no memory. So there's memory involved in how the distributions of motor commands change, but there's no memory involved. It cannot look back and think, oh, last time I moved my right arm, the mobile moved, and this time I moved my right arm and the mobile moved again.
I see. So it'd be like model-free learning and reinforcement learning.
Yeah, but in the absolutist simplest version of that, because even model-free learning in reinforcement learning still usually has some memory, and this baby bot has none whatsoever.
Thanks.
Okay. So what we were curious about is this disconnect phase, and basically we set up another study asking whether we can find any evidence that infants are building a causal model of their actions and the effects of their actions. And what we were interested in is to see in behavior whether we would find an extinction burst like we saw in previous studies. But of course, there's a small issue with only this pattern, namely that infants, like, of course, by the end of the study, infants also just get fussier, and infants just start to move more because they lose their attention and they just don't want to anymore. So we wanted to avoid that any effect that we saw of more movement in the disconnect phase was purely based on infants just fussing out. We, in addition, also measured EEG, and we were looking for a mismatch negativity response as triggered by the lack of effect. So what we were comparing is the baseline phase versus the disconnect phase. In both those phases, nothing happens, right? They move and nothing happens. But of course, you can see it as a pre and post learning situation. So what we have here is 2 minutes of static visual stimulus, and no matter how much the babies move, nothing happens. Then we had 3.5 minutes of sort of a connect phase where the movement of the trigger arm, this was counterbalance per arm, would cause the image to move and would trigger sort of audio-visual response. And then in the disconnect phase again, when the babies moved, nothing would happen. And we basically argued that in the baseline phase, when nothing happens, the infants should not be surprised by this. But in the disconnect phase, if they move and nothing happens, they should actually experience a violation of expectation if they have learned that their action is causing that movement to happen. If they have not learned that, we would also not expect to see anything. So we tested 65, or we invited 65 infants to the lab, and we had custom-made accelerometer bracelets. So we had one accelerometer per arm and also actually one per leg. We had a 32 active electrode EEG cap. And basically in this middle picture is sort of what the setup was. So in the left bottom corner, in the left top corner, you can see basically what the infant is seeing on the screen. It's sort of for us a mirror for the infant screen. And the infant was just sitting there with the cap on and with the accelerometers around the arms and the legs. And yeah, so I already explained this, but basically the study was a total of 7.5 minutes. This is a very long time for 3 to 4.5 month old infants. Like, it was very hard for them to make it through the entire experiment. Just to remind you, what we were expecting is a violation of expectation for the disconnect phase versus the baseline phase. And just for the neuroscientists here, the latencies are a little bit later than you would expect normally for a mismatch negativity. And this is because latencies are always later in infant ERPs. So this is we took it from basically previous work on infant MMNs. And of course, in the behavior, we were expecting to find an extinction burst in the disconnect phase. We did not find it at all. So our EEG data, the green line is the disconnect phase. And I mean, you can clearly see that this one is not showing a mismatch negativity. In the behavior, maybe when you're eyeballing it, it looks like there's something there, but actually statistically, we did not find any effect of a extinction burst in the disconnect phase there either. So that sucks, right? But what we did find is that actually those infants that did show a negative deflection during the limbs, so did show a negative deflection in the MMN, in the EEG, actually were the ones who did show a limb-specific extinction burst. And those infants with a positive deflection did not. So what you see in this EEG is basically potentially two groups of infants which have cancelled each other out, and a little bit of an effect in the behavioral results, which is then driven, right, like, which wasn't significant, but why we are seeing still something that looks like it in an eyeballing manner is because there was a group of infants where they did seem to have an extinction burst. So this difference between these two groups, the ones with the negative deflection and the positive deflection, was not caused by a difference in age. It was not that the one group was older than the other. And from it, we sort of carefully conclude that maybe sense of agency is beginning to emerge at this age, but we clearly don't see it yet at the group level. So unlike previous studies that have claimed that the agency is maybe there already from 2 months, this is not at all what our findings would support. So I, in the beginning about the framework, said that a mechanism is explanatory of a phenomenon when its parts and processes can account for the entire phenomenon. So with this group, this small group of infants who did show this effect, can we then say, well, we now have found evidence for the required representation in its entirety, and can we now conclude a sense of agency? I'm not sure. So my work focused strongly on the causal part of the representation. My action A caused event E. But one might argue that there's also a need to explore the self part of the representation. So it's also my action caused event E. And in the experiments, the sense of self has been implicitly assumed. Right, like I did not actually study it, and it is still really an open question of sort of what this sense of self really is. So presumably it's not a fully fledged adult-like sense of self, but what is it then, and how did it develop? And I think there is a lot of work in developmental science. There's a lot of work in philosophy, which gives some hints about this. But I think there's still really an open question in sort of, okay, say this baby has a causal, right? Like it makes some sort of causal inference about the action and the event. Does it then mean there is a my already involved, and right? And also, if so, sort of where did it come from? And of course, that would then help also in self-other distinction, right? Like there's a lot of research in developmental science on like how do babies come to experience, experience themselves from others and differentiate themselves from others. And overall, of course, there's a lot of cognitive capacities that then hinge on that. So if you want to do turn taking in language, you need to first differentiate yourself from other, or if you want to take responsibility, you need to be able to say what your actions have caused. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done there, and I actually hope that someone will pick that up, or maybe I will eventually, but I think there's still, so I think although we've made some progress there, we haven't fully made it through. Another thing that needs to be addressed are the factors that are facilitating this sense of agency. So if you, right, like from our EEG study, it seems that there's variability in when the sense of agency emerges, but it does not say anything about what causes this variability. And to address this, we set up a study investigating the relation between the extinction burst and motor development. So what we did is basically we ran another set of infants, and we didn't do EEG in this case. We only did behavior. But basically, we ran another mobile paradigm, which was fairly similar to the previous one, where we wanted to know whether the infants are showing their extinction burst, and also to what extent the infants are showing a limb-specific extinction burst. And the main reason for looking for limb specificity is also that the limb specificity would give even stronger evidence again that it's not just infants being fussy, but infants actually knowing that there is, or I don't know about knowing, but like detecting that there's some relation between specifically that limb and the effect. We also then assessed the motor development. So the main measure that we used here was the kinematics of their reaching behavior. So we used the Qualisys motion tracking system, and basically had infants reach for an object. And we know so normally if you do a reach, you have basically one movement unit. So you have an acceleration and a deceleration, and this goes in a fairly, if you're an adult and you have reasonably good motor control, it goes in a fairly smooth transition. So you have one sort of set where you accelerate towards the object and then you decelerate as you get closer to it. We know with infants, they do not have one movement unit. So when they reach, they're constantly sort of adjusting their movement a little bit to get to the object. And so what we took as a measure for motor development is the number of movement units, where the lower number of movement units would indicate a better motor development than a higher number of movement units. And the other thing we did is we took a parental questionnaire, in this case, the Vineland Adaptive Behavioral Skills, which is a fairly crude measure of motor development and of but we wanted to have sort of a second measure, and we also took the questionnaire to exclude any effect of general sort of development. So we wanted to make sure that if we would find a relation, that it would really truly be about an increased motor development and not just infants that are sort of cognitively further generally. So we had these two measures. And basically what we wanted to know is, do we see that infants with fewer movement units are more likely to show an extinction burst or even a limb-specific extinction burst? And we found no evidence for that. So we found no relation between motor development and causal model building. What we did find was we found that the motor part of the VAPS actually correlated quite well to the movement unit. So it seems that our sort of two measures of motor development were correlated to each other, which is comforting, but we did not find any relation between motor development and causal model building. And we actually subsequently set up a study with adults where we tested for judgment of agency rather than sense of agency, because I mean, with adults you can just ask them, so we did. And there also we took handedness as a measure of motor control. So we had them do things with their left hand and do things with their right hand. And there also we found no difference between sort of the motor control and judgment of agency. And this is puzzling because it seems very unlikely to me that there is no relation. I think we ran nice studies, and actually our baby study was like, it had a good sample and everything. It didn't have a lot of noise in the data, but it just seems very unlikely that there is no relation between sense of agency and motor development or motor control. Also because all theories or models about sense of agency are rooted in motor control, right? So it just doesn't seem likely that there is no relation. But neither of our studies found any. So what we at least sort of carefully conclude from that is that potentially this relation is either more complex than we thought, or that that we managed to tap into exactly the wrong parts of it, of the motor aspect of it. But yeah, so I think there's still an open question about how it can be that we find no relation there, because I still don't believe that there isn't one. I think it would be interesting to sort of further quantify and qualify what that relation then has to be. That still leaves us with the question then, what is facilitating the sense of agency or the emergence of the sense of agency? And so we found no evidence for age difference there, and so far no evidence also for motor development, although, as I said, I think it's unlikely that there isn't any at all. So speculatively, potentially there's something still in social interaction. Of course, babies have a lot of social interaction. They basically right, they're almost, well, in a very large part of their time, they are interacting with parents and other caregivers. And we also know that sense of agency is important for social interaction. So I could imagine that there's something there. And so far, research into developing sense of agency doesn't feature much social interaction. So it's not really something that has been explored. But what has been explored is that those infants who are better at detecting social contingencies also are better at detecting non-social contingencies, and so there seems to be some influence there. And of course, in the context of the self-other distinction, the social interaction plays a big part. So yeah, what I hope to have conveyed is that infants are not just in compliance smelly miniature adults, and that actually studying them also, especially if you study the emergence, is that you actually want to take a slightly different approach, that although taking inspiration from adult science is a very good source of knowledge, and it's a very good place to start. There are different requirements for studying emergence, and there are different requirements for what is necessary to make your conclusions. And I think specifically for the sense of agency, previously proposed models and empirical studies have made a first step into researching the developing sense of agency, and I think it's been really interesting. And with our sort of theoretical and simulation work, we've identified some problems with these interpretations and identified some open questions that we then try to subsequently address. So with our EEG experiment, we try to tap into the disconnect phase rather than the connect phase of the experiment. And we showed that at least a subset of infants seems to show those behaviors and those brain responses that we were expecting. So that might indicate that the sense of agency is starting to emerge at 3 to 4.5 months of age. But we don't find this effect on the group level yet. So it doesn't seem that it's completely there in this age bracket. I think other aspects such as motor development and social interaction require further investigation. We made a start with the motor development, but yeah, I think there's more types of things to explore. What is difficult about studying the motor development, and the reason why we went for the kinematics, is because you ideally want a measure of motor development that is somewhat unrelated to the sensory motor contingency detection that you are already testing for the sense of agency measure. So I sort of wanted to make sure that you don't have sort of two measures of motor development that are practically the same. Yeah, potentially there's more to explore there. And I think one part that in my story is still missing is the sense of self. So I think there's this is a big part of sense of agency, and there are people who have been studying this, but I think there's still many open questions about sort of how this sense of self bootstraps towards the sense of agency, bootstraps towards maybe a different sense of self, and I can imagine that there's sort of a whole chain of reactions going on there in development. So I had many collaborators during my PhD, so I've listed all of them here, and as well as the papers that I discussed today. And of course, I'm very happy that the parents wanted to participate in my study with their infants. For some of them, it was the first time out of the house after giving birth. So it was like a big deal. And the infants were really tiny. For the neuroscientists here, the infant EEG cap was size 40. So most of the time, like sometimes we had a 38, sometimes we had a 42, but like most of them are size 40. It's like slightly bigger than your fist. So it's really tiny. And with that, I would like to again thank the organizers of the Consciousness Club for inviting me, and thank all of you for your attention.
Great, thanks. Let's all mute and give Lorijn a round of applause. Awesome, that was a great talk. Thank you, Lorijn. So for the Q&A, we'd like to use the raise hand function. So if you can find that on your Zoom panel. While people are looking for that, I don't see any questions yet. I'll just take this time to ask a question myself. So I found this really interesting, and I especially liked this bit where you dissociate between the connect phase and the disconnect phase, and saying that maybe the disconnect phase is this thing that we should be looking at based on these model simulation. I thought that was really elegant and very interesting. But then I think I'm still a little bit confused on how we can conclude sense of agency from that, because in a way you just like, you then learned an expectation and then you get an expectation violation. Okay, fair enough. And then because of this violation, you might want to like do your predictor, do your kind of, what is it, active inference. So you like check what's going on, but then why does that mean that there's a causal inference? Why does the causal inference have to underlie that behavior? I was a bit unsure about that.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. So I think our reasoning was that, okay, first of all, we want to know, with the mobile paradigm, there's a couple of reasons why infants could be increasing in movement frequency, right? One reason, which would be very uninteresting, is that they like the effect. They're just excited. This has nothing to do with anything they've learned about how they play with it, right? Like this is just, they're like, woo, right? And when we saw the little boy with the balloons in the beginning, I have no idea, right? Like I can't tell you whether this boy is just really excited about the balloons or whether this boy has some idea about, hey, if I move my arms, these balloons are moving as well. Now, of course, there's so this was sort of the starting point for this whole whole investigation, and so we wanted to at least avoid that. Now one can avoid that partially, at least by limb specificity, right? Like if you see that they're only moving their right arm, then presumably it's not just because they're excited. But in many, if not most studies of the mobile paradigm, we don't see limb specificity. We see that they're just moving more. And basically what we argued is, okay, so if so you at the very least indeed need to already have built some expectation, right? Like if you want to see a violation of expectation, there needs to be an expectation first. And I think for the sake of sort of this study, we basically said, well, if there's an expectation, then what is that expectation? And if the expectation is, well, I move, right? If I move, the things move, then for us, that was good enough to say, then the infants have some awareness of their relation to the movement of the thing. So that was basically the argument. The argument was basically, if there is any expectation, then the expectation must have something to do with their relation to them.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, and then it makes sense that they make the point later that the sense of self is very important and missing in this.
Yeah, because of course that's not really what we studied, right?
Yeah.
Like it was really like, technically it could be, I don't know, right? But it could be that infants is aware of some relation between arm movement and stimulus movement, but not necessarily between themselves and arm.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
no,
that could be.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
So I think this is how we sort of got there. Yeah, and also why this is also why we wanted to compare it to the baseline phase, of course, because it's still them, but they wouldn't have had any expectation at that point in any case.
Yeah, thanks. That's clear. I saw that Steve raised his hand, but I wonder if Morgan has a question related to this. I'm not sure.
My question's on a different matter.
Okay, then maybe Steve can go first because he was first. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and actually it does. My question is following up on a similar line of thought. So thanks, Lorijn, for the talk. So I was wondering about the broader framing of these results in terms of sensitive agency, and whether you could reframe the investigation in terms of goal-directed control, or something in terms of planning, or holding some causal model of the future, and none of that would be about subjective experience. So we have increasingly, as we know around, in the world around us, we have artificial intelligence algorithms that do have look-ahead planning, that have causal models, and most of us don't yet, I guess, think that they have subjective sense of agency, as you mentioned yourself.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether the paradigms you're looking at here, especially this delayed extinction phase, that does seem to be potentially a sensitive marker for the kind of more model-based planning or goal-directed action algorithms that might be emerging at that age. But I guess I just don't see why you would need to kind of assume that that was a marker